Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Roundtable. In today's Roundtable, we, the members of History and Culture Cluster, in collaboration with the members of the IR Cluster, would be discussing the refugee crisis that the newly formed states India and Pakistan witnessed right after their partition in the year 1947. We would analyze the historical implications, the perspectives, and differential experiences of different groups of people and the responses on part of the national governments as well as the international platforms. Hemant and I would be facilitating today's roundtable, so please raise your hands if you have any points to make. Before commencing with the discussion, I would like to give a brief introduction to the refugee crisis of 1947. The partition of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan resulted in what has been called one of the greatest mass migrations in human history. About 15 million people were displaced. Most of the refugees did not have any realization that the departure was permanent, as they left with few valuables and some money. They thought that once normalcy was restored, they would return back home. Those who could afford to left in planes and ships. However, most took the regular trains, and those with very limited financial resources are bound to travel on foot. The refugee crisis was aggravated given that both the countries were newly formed with scattered and limited resources and under the influence of bitter relationships. This takes me to the first question for today's roundtable. How did the refugee crisis of 1947 shape the relations between newly formed India and Pakistan? Yes, Raymond?
Yes, so the refugee crisis that started after 1947 had really strained relations between the two states of India and Pakistan. It reinforced that colonial notion that the Hindus should go back to the original state of India as they were evicted from parts of Punjab and Sindh and even parts of eastern Bengal. So it reinforced the idea, the religiously divided idea of partition that was sort of colonially construed. And because of the refugee pressure on each nation, I mean, particularly India, because more people came this side towards East Punjab and towards West Bengal, the the bureaucratic strain of having to, make way for such refugees in areas which were known as camps formed in Mumbai, formed in Agra, formed in Delhi. So these things got more strained, and therefore the division of resources also was more strained between the two nations. That Pakistan being the aggressive nation state, the idea of Pakistan being the aggressive nation that who evicted citizens who were sort of making a great living out there, because people, particularly people Hindus in West Punjab who were evicted, were actually landlords there, and they were making a good living out there. So, because a wave of such migrants were pushed out from the Pakistan side, this gave a lot of strain to the relations, to bilateral relations, which later ensued in a in a I think an era long rivalry that has been through with us.
Yes, Sarah?
Right. The refugee crisis of 1947 had a far-reaching implications for the relations between India and Pakistan. The mass mitigation and displacement between the two nations and the violence and the communal tensions during the partition led to a collective trauma that was felt by both Hindus and Muslims, as Raymond also mentioned. This trauma, coupled with the loss of lives and forced mitigation of communities, created a legacy of bitterness between the two nations and a great suspicion that existed and which continue to exist and shape our relationship for years now. So the refugee crisis not only strained diplomatic ties but also fueled the conflicts, such as the India-Pakistan wars that happened and contributed majorly to the perpetuation of the unresolved territorial disputes, such as the issue of Jammu and Kashmir.
Right. I think these are great points on how the refugee crisis further fueled suspicion on part of the people, and it further fueled the disputes and also just the colonial fantasies. But at the same time, I think it's also to be noted that you know, these also led to the collaboration on part of both the states to some level, because given that both the countries were newly formed and nobody really expected this magnitude of displacement. And even Nehru said that in one of the conferences that none of us expected a major transfer of population at any given time. So even though they had a SAR past, but in some levels, they also kind of collaborated and cooperated with each other in terms of like reaching out to international organizations such as the British Red Cross to seek assistance on the common refugee crisis. And also like they came to the pact such as Nehru Liaquat Ali Pact. So I think that is also something that should be noted. But of course, yes, these are great points on how, this thing on the bilateral relationships between India and Pakistan was fueled on one side, but also it kind of had some positive relationship between the two of them. So it was not just, it was a very strained kind of relationship where both of them were kind of trying to work out in different ways. So this takes me to the next question on what were the steps taken by the Indian and Pakistani governments to deal with the refugee crisis? Yes, Hemant?
So first of all, to begin with, the partition was a major event that neither India and for the least part, even Pakistan was not prepared for it. It can be seen in the matter that in the early days, Pakistan didn't even have a capital. They were arguing about where the capital should be while the refugee crisis was ongoing. And there's also division of the armed forces. The armed services were given options whether to go to India or go to Pakistan. So there weren't enough law enforcement officers to control the tide of violence that was happening in Punjab. And the only thing that was there was the Punjab Boundary Force, a PBF, that was a 50,000 strong law enforcement force. Even that was proving to be incapable of handling the refugee crisis. But the issue was that India, as a richer state with a far better organized administrative system, was able to carry out its refugees and put them into camps. While for Pakistan, it provided a far greater problem to where to bring those refugees to. And in early days, it resulted in camp cities in outside Lahore, outside Multan, and which resulted in lack of pencils, even basic pencils to write the names of people. It resulted in lack of basic sanitation for people. So in a situation, partition affected both India and Pakistan quite disproportionately, because India had a better organized administrative system. So therefore, they were able to withstand the shock, while Pakistan was suffering from a lack of it, and they weren't able to treat refugees the same way as India did. So that, I believe, was the difference between the response of the Indian government and the Pakistani government.
Yes, that's a great point, actually. And also, just to add on to that, the refugee crisis was also further exacerbated by the monsoon floods and also the cholera crisis that was happening because of the sanitation and also the hygiene in refugee camps are often compromised. So even be it Indian government or the Pakistani government, both were quite stressed about not just providing for ration cards and free ration, but also in terms of just providing them with drugs and providing them with necessary medicines. So moving forward, it is important to note that the refugees had similar yet different experiences depending on various factors. So the next question in this regard is, how did the refugee crisis and the rehabilitation process manifest itself differently for different groups, especially for the women? Yes, Aditya?
So as we all discussed, millions of people were displaced during the refugee crisis after the partition of India. But women in particular faced immense challenge and hardships, considering there was widespread violence, including abduction, rape, and forced marriages. The trauma of these experiences also had long-lasting effects, not only on the survivors, but also on their families. The process of rehabilitation and recovery for abducted women was very difficult and extremely complex. With many facing rejection from their families due to social stigma, even after they were found. So women in refugee camps also endured harsh conditions such as overcrowding, lack of privacy, and sexual violence. They also had to adapt to roles as the new roles as breadwinners, as many men were killed or missing during the partition. Resettlement was also a complex process requiring women to navigate bureaucratic hurdles to claim compensation and find housing, often without adequate literacy or knowledge. So this is how it affected women disproportionately in other groups. So, yeah.
Yes, Tanish?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the point of the social stigma that was there, because there were a lot of honor killings also happening during the time of the partition. So a lot of families practiced honor killings against women, and that was also one of the ways there was disproportionate amount of trauma given to women.
Yes, and also just to add on to that, I think the resettlement process was very complicated because there was this one thing that was formed called the Recovery of Abducted Persons Ordinance. And according to this, any female child under the age of 16 and all the women found on the other side of the border were to be recovered and sent back to their homes at all costs. So this was quite complicated in the nature that all the women had to go to the original homes, what was called as the original homes. And this kind of limited their agency because they did not have any voice to decide whether or not in the first place they wanted to go back or not. Because some of them had actually found peace in the new places, in their new homes. Some of them had found love. Some of them had formed families and relationship ties. So it was pretty complicated like that because the women were devoid of any agency or any voice in the entire process. And also, not just that, but Urvashi Butalia has also come up with a great book on the other side of silence, where she spoke a lot about how the women kind of had to go through disproportionate experiences. And Pipa Vardi has also come up with an article on, how the entire process should not only be looked at from the side of agency, because, when you consider women as only victims, it kind of restricts the knowledge in that sense, because there were actually a lot of female refugees who were also going on to the other sides. And of course, this is pretty classist in the sense that, only women from the upper classes were allowed social mobility who would go to the refugee camps and help other people. So yes, that was there. But also just in terms of the refugees also, there was some level of agency in the sense that the refugees who had migrated, like who had shifted to Delhi, they actually took up prostitution as one of their jobs, as one of their roles, because the male members of the household were no longer there to support them financially. So this is quite a complicated state because while different women tried to navigate in different ways, others were completely devoid of any voice and any agency in that sense. So I think Dhimant would take up from here.
Thank you. Now, as we know, partition was a division between two different nations. So I would like to ask, what was the reaction of the international community on this partition? Because it was a major event. Yes, Sarah.
Right, thank you. So the response to the refugee crisis post 1947 varied a lot from the international perspective side. Some countries and international organizations did recognize the magnitude of the crisis and also provided humanitarian aid and support to the refugees. Even the United Nations, for instance, established a relief operation and initiated efforts to address the refugee situation. However, the response was not always commensurate with the scale of the crisis. And many refugees face challenges in accessing the adequate support and assistance that was provided by them. Additionally, the geopolitical considerations and the Cold War dynamics, additionally, the lack of consensus among the global powers hindered a more concentrated and concerted international response to address the refugee crisis effectively, in my opinion.
Wonderful point, Sarah. Tejas, what are your points on this?
I think Sarah covered much of it, but just adding on to it, unfortunately, given the magnitude of the refugee crisis at that time, there was no um, international organization other than the UN that could actually handle this situation. Because even the UNHCR, High Commissioner for Refugees, was established in 1951. So even they did not exist at that time.
Yes, wonderful point. Rohit, do you have to say?
Yeah, so just reiterating Sarah's point, all these efforts, I mean, efforts were made, but all of this was fairly short term. Nothing really materialized in the long term. And again, India and Pakistan did try to initiate reallocation efforts, but this didn't materialize at all.
Okay, wonderful point. This reminds me of a story in which Liaquat Ali Khan goes to California. He was asking for aid for Pakistan. And what happened that a businessman looked at the menu, which showed the map of Pakistan, and he asked with all his seriousness that the empty space between the two parts is this Africa? And he had to react extremely seriously to that no, it's not Africa, it's something else. This shows how much disassociated the partition was for the international community. Now, other point I would like to ask is what was the view of the new elites that came to power in Karachi and Delhi on the partition crisis, the refugee crisis? Rohit, would you like to say on this?
Sure. So the views of the elites can be seen as twofold, right? On one hand, it provided them a opportunity to come to the center stage, take up new, significant roles in national politics. But again, a lot of laws were being rewritten, and essentially their identity as the so-called elites were being questioned, and that posed a lot of pressure to them.
Good point. Good points. Anybody else like to say on that? Okay, then moving on to the next question. Now, as we know that this partition was a founding myth of India, so how are refugees dealt with today in India after this experience of the partition? Yes, Tanish.
Well, in the context of illegal migration, there's a lot of migrants coming from Myanmar and Bangladesh. So it causes a huge liability for the Indian state. But we can't deport all of those refugees because of the pressure from the international community. So like as of now, migrants are kind of a big liability in the context of Myanmar and Bangladesh, illegal migration.
Sarah, your point.
Yeah, thank you. So, while India initially provided refugee support to millions of displaced individuals and subsequently, providing them an environment to live in and to fulfill their basic necessities, still factors such as political consideration and security concerns till now shape how refugees are looked at and dealt with in India. There have been instances of both inclusive and restrictive policies towards refugees, depending on the specific group and geopolitical context. And challenging in accessing the rights and services have persisted ever since. And the debates surrounding the citizenship and identity have emerged thereon. Like within India, we see that there is a lot of what is your nationality or what is your religion. And the experiences of refugees in India today reflect the complexity and the complex interplay of legal, political, social, and economic factors, and highlighting the ongoing need for comprehensive and compassionate refugee policies to emerge and be there.
Wonderful point, Sarah. Raymond, do you have to say something about it?
Yeah. So today, as of now, the refugee identity is clearly a determinant of how a refugee might be treated after their immigration into India. With questions of illegal immigration, as discussed from Bangladesh and coming in from Bangladesh and Myanmar, a nation like India, which has been historically receptive to so many refugees, has, across its political spectrum, been treating these refugees either as a liability or as even as a benefit. Liability in the sense that coming stories with the current right-wing reaction to Rohingya refugees emigrating into Uttarakhand and changing the demography. That question is really a very political question that continues to haunt any acceptance of refugees. So I think the identity factor has become a strong implication for now for the intake of refugees and the nature of their behavior as perceived by the elites in sitting in the political parties.
Good points. Mitrajit? Mitrajit, do you have to say something about it?
Yeah, first and foremost, a very good afternoon to everyone. So I was listening to all the points being put forward. I'm just trying to start this from a different notion, as already some of my peers have mentioned about the identity crisis. So related to this, I recall a news which came 3 weeks back. There was a Bengali couple who were arrested in Bangalore by NIA because apparently NIA thought that they are Bangladeshis and they are not from West Bengal. They were in prison for 3 months, despite showing Aadhaar card and everything. They were still in prison, and then West Bengal government had to intervene to get them released. Now, this may be, this is a real travesty when we think about that. Indian government, of course, has its right to protect its borders and to stop illegal migration. But even today, the question of identity, and especially in terms of refugees, for people coming in from either the western part or maybe the eastern part, mostly West Bengal, is quite confusing. This answer may be stretched a bit long. Many casual jokes. In fact, I have heard, being a Bengali, oh, you guys are Bengalis, very similar to Bangladeshis, right? Which is culturally true, but the jokes are thrown about. And coming from a refugee background family, like long time back, my forefathers come from today's Bangladesh. I don't know how many of you are aware about football rivalry which goes on between East Bengal and Mohun Bagan. So again, this has also implications because many Mohun Bagan fans, who apparently were the natives of West Bengal before partition, and they casually say to the people of, who are supporting the rival club, that, oh, you guys come from Bangladesh, you guys have like actually come in crossing the border and you guys have got cut marks on your back. It may seem that I'm digressing from the topic, but if looked at very closely, the discussion about refugee identity and all, this has specifically been a very important part in Punjab and West Bengal. That is because even today there are refugees coming in from Bangladesh who may be illegal or mostly illegal probably, and some they take asylum and everything, including the Rohingyas. But this kind of scenario and problem has been going on in these two parts for a very long time. If I'm allowed to continue, I hope that's not an issue if I can continue further.
No, please continue. It's a very interesting point you say about it.
Yeah, thank you. So related to this, many of my peers already mentioned about how this, so it's quite funny because the thing is that imagine you get displaced from your own home. The points were already raised, but when we speak about how, why did the international community could not take a part? It's my understanding, and probably it's also well documented by many historians, that international community, there were reporters who came in from Germany, especially after Second World War, when India was on the verge of independence, but as well as horrible scenes of partition was going on. They came to Calcutta even before independence in around the year 1946, when Muslim League declared Direct Action Day on 16th of August, when Muhammad Ali Jinnah said to his followers that it's time to take action. And it was not only Nazi Germany, the night of the long knives, the same thing happened in Bengal. It was known as the week of the long knives, when dead bodies with pregnant women and their bellies ripped up with the fetus coming out of it. In fact, many German reporters actually saw those images, they took pictures, and they said that they have not even seen these kind of horrible scenes even in concentration camps. Because by that time, Germany was already liberated from the Nazi regime. The World War II had ended and India was on the verge. So the partition, and I think the refugee crisis, the word which has been used repeatedly in this roundtable is that it was a complicated issue, and it truly is, because a British gentleman coming in from England who never has been to the Indian subcontinent, Radcliffe, spending 45 days in the hot summertime, drinking tea and making, I mean, pardon my language, but making literally your drawing room in Dhaka and your restroom in Tripura, Agartala, without thinking that millions of families who have lived together with their shared cultural history and heritage, today they are going to become separate, and the same thing is going on. I think that's where I think this refugee crisis, along with the identity, plays a very important part. And just, I mean, I have taken a lot of time, but just before I conclude, this is my personal experience. I mean, even today, I feel that there is not much difference between Soumya Sarkar and Litan Das playing in Bangladesh and Mitrajit Biswas staying in West Bengal. I mean, culturally, we are very similar. And if you speak about the religion, there are, I mean, even a large number of Muslim people staying even in West Bengal. So the basis and identity of partition and that whole refugee crisis, it may be like something which may not make sense now, but I think it was very unfortunate, of course, and it could have possibly not be avoided. But ultimately, this is what happened. But looking in retrospect, I think this was supposed to happen probably for a long period of time. And since the time of Stafford Cripps mission and all this, the whole thing was building up. But yeah, this is how unfortunate things have been. Thank you so much for giving me time to speak so long.
Wonderful points, and I believe that was extremely knowledgeable for all of us to learn about such interesting facets about life. So I thank all of you for coming and joining for this roundtable on the refugee crisis during the partition era. I believe we all have learned something much more, and we are able to understand the historical experiences of the people and historical experiences that the nations experienced during this tumultuous time, which saw the birth of a nation, birth of two nations. And I thank you all for this.